Hi there, it's Ben here, and welcome to my video on engaging critically with the core content framework. This is the second video that I've explicitly talked about the core content framework in, probably the third or fourth that I've mentioned it in, and this video links to two others that two others specifically, one of which you'll have come across before, my video right at the beginning of the course, which is Cognitive Science, the Core Content Framework and Research Literacy, but also this is paired with the Research Literacy Part 2 video by Catherine McCrory. So do go and have a look at that yourself, though if you haven't been allocated that one, you'll obviously hear about it through others. But as with any of the videos, they're all available for you to watch yourself. So it's particularly a companion piece to the first video because the first video talks quite a lot about cognitive science, and in this regard I mapped out 6 common approaches from cognitive science that are advocated commonly by cognitive educationalists, I guess I would call them, cognitive science educationalists. And I want to give a quick update in the style of Sue Gray, an update because what I hadn't realized actually when I'd done the last video in September 2021 was that in July, just a couple of months before that, the Education Endowment Foundation had produced a review of the evidence so far that talks about how effective cognitive science approaches are in the classroom. This is interesting, the outcomes. They say, look, they can have real impact, okay? And there's a value to teachers knowing what cognitive science approaches are. That's great. We've started to map those out for you. I hope in subjects you consider these as well. However, the evidence of application to the classroom, so not under lab conditions, but in application to the classroom, is limited, and it's also limited in terms of their applicability to different subjects, different age ranges and phases, etc. Also, applying those principles is not straightforward. It's not just take the principle and throw it into your classroom. There's a lot of questions that need answering in that process about what should be used, when, why, for what content, for what subject, for what topic, etc., etc. So that use of your teacher professionalism is really significant. It's not just a catch-all, use it all the time, and also. These principles interact, and little research has been done about the impacts of them taken together, and when is the appropriate time to mix them and to use them, and how to use them at the right time, etc. And also how do you use them when considering other impacts? A lot of the cognitive science literature, for example, is silent on what students how students should be arranged, the social context of learning, whether they should be in pairs, in small groups, in larger groups, etc. Often the cognitive science literature is completely silent on that, and it's such a significant impact. So this review of the evidence says that obviously cognitive science principles need to take into consideration wider practical and pedagogical things, and a lot of the literature just doesn't. And a lot of the books that have becoming more and more popular about cognitive science approaches black box that, and so is the conclusion that we have kids sitting in rows, and a direct and response kind of formula to teaching the whole time, and restrict kids to just chatting in pairs. Without exploring that, without thinking about that, I think it's really problematic. And that kind of represents, in a sense, or at least my take on the core content framework, that in and of themselves, the approaches espoused within it can be useful at given times, under given circumstances, but there's a whole lot missing. And what are the consequences of not considering that? We must consider that. So that's your sort of takeaway as we begin this video. Right, so coming up in this video, let's map everything out. I'm going to give you an overview of the core content framework, some reasons to engage with it, a summary of the key content, some reasons to engage with it critically, I've hinted upon those already. Then we're going to do a deep dive into its research base, pick up some examples, and then think about some common things that are either bypassed slightly by the core content framework or posited as a learning myth that needs to be debunked by the core content framework. And then we'll draw some conclusions. I've got to do this all within 40-45 minutes, so let's get moving. So here's our overview. We know that it's a minimum entitlement, and the government are very clear on this. It's a minimum entitlement for all ITT trainees, no matter where you are in the country. It's a recent phenomenon. Our courses had to be adapted to ensure we included this minimum entitlement, and they were adapted from last year. It's drawn from the early career framework. So it's essentially a copy and paste from something that was developed for year 1 and year 2 post-qualification teachers, okay, previously NQTs, and copied and pasted down to PGC student teachers, for example, to initial teacher trainees, to give a sort of all-through 3-year developmental curriculum, which sounds great, but I mean, there were lots of criticisms at the time that you can't just take a curriculum that's designed for people that have already qualified and say that's the same curriculum as people that need to qualify. But opponents to that would say, well, actually, it's a common language, a common discourse, a common approach to teaching that everyone that everyone knows, and therefore, it's not going to change that much between your training year and your year 1 and 2, and therefore having that common approach is helpful and useful. It's arranged around 5 key areas, but actually it's broken down into 8 parts. Those 5 areas are very similar to our 6 competencies, and that's, in a sense, how we approach the core content framework. We include all of the elements within our 6 competencies. The only difference between their 5 areas, our 6 competencies, is that we split pedagogy and we take out inclusive teaching because we think that's so important. It should be a standalone competency, whereas in the core content framework, it's subsumed within that. But to be honest, the way that core content framework is presented is in the 8 parts, the 8 dimensions, in a sense, of the teaching standards. So it doesn't really matter anyway. So there we go. Just a reminder of our core competencies of knowledge and curriculum assessment, positive relationships, inclusive teaching, pedagogy and planning, and the foundation, which is your professional values and well-being. Let's move on. Structure-wise, it's divided into learn that statements, which is essentially the content that you need to know. And they mirror the early career framework, and then learn how to statements, which are much more about the context of how you will learn that, and then what skills and knowledge you will build and how that's built through feedback and mentoring, and that is specific to ITT, so initial teacher training. Here we go. You've got the learn that statements down the left, the learn how to statements on the right, which is all about how you learn these things, and what skills and knowledge you how you go about picking up skills and knowledge through the provider, which is us, and your school-based practices. So there we go. Now, the danger is that actually it comes with quite an extensive introduction, and that introduction, they say, look, you only need to read these bits in conjunction with the introduction. And the introduction emphasizes that actually it wants student teachers to analyze and critique theory, research, and expert practice, okay? But a less confident provider may stick rigidly to that theory and that research and not expand upon it and not necessarily critique it. So it's really key. It does actually say we should be doing that, which is what we are doing. And secondly, it says, look, it doesn't set out the full curriculum, in part because teaching is really complicated and teaching is very specific to subject, to what's being taught and the age range when students are learning things. And you can't just summarize that with a generic set of things that all teachers have to do all the time. So that's a key point. Finally, it's pretty bold in that the government is now, and this created a lot of furore at the time and still does to some degree, the government's taking a venture into, through the DfE, telling teachers how to teach. And that used to, in a sense, be a preserve of teachers. the government's moving away from the notion that it was up to teachers to decide what approaches they want to use in their classrooms. And I mean, look, that initial Education Endowment Foundation research is saying, well, actually, teacher judgment is the thing that's so key here. And that research literacy, that ability to understand and try out and experiment and research yourselves in your own classes when to use certain approaches, what approaches to combine, and how to integrate them, cognitive approaches, into social spaces that are classrooms, is, that is the right thing to be doing. So so there we go. So you do still have, in a sense, although the government is trying to be a bit more prescriptive, you do have agency in this. Finally, there are some suggested readings provided, but the actual statements in the core content framework aren't directly referenced. So you're left sort of, well, what research supports what claims or statements? But anyway, we'll come and look at that in a bit. Why engage with it? Well, obviously, it's a common entitlement for everyone. So that gives you familiarity, connection to any student teacher, any qualifying teacher in England, no matter the course they follow. You're going to have that shared language, that shared discourse. You're going to be, obviously, it engagement with that literature supports your ability to be a free-thinking, independent professional, which is what we're trying to get you to do, and it gives you that a bank of research to interrogate, which can only be a good thing. Obviously, it's content-wise, it gives you the same as the early career framework and early career teachers follow, and therefore it familiarizes you with what you'll also encounter in your first and second years of qualified teaching. So it gives you a foundation for those. And a lot of the content is going to make you and help you become a better teacher if it's used judiciously and if you use your professionalism rather than seeing it as a straitjacket which you've got to use all the time. Okay, and here is a summary of I think the key elements of the content. This really builds from the subject and content, the how pupils learn, and the classroom practice elements of the core content framework. It doesn't speak so much about behavior, it doesn't speak so much about assessment and adaptive teaching, but or professionalism. So let's go through it. This is a summary of both the principles at play and then the teaching strategies, how I've kind of organized this, the teaching strategies that flow from that. So the principles is pretty similar to what I talked about in that original video. Its definition of learning is a lasting change in capabilities or understanding, which is a bit broader than Ofsted's definition of learning as a long-term change in memory. This, indicates that it is about more than just knowledge. It's about capabilities as well. In terms of memory, it builds on and takes a lot of its lead from information processing theory, where we've got short-term or working memory, where the active processing happens, where your capacity is limited, and it's really easily to overload that. Certainly if you're working without much long-term memory help, if you don't have that foundation of long-term memory, that's taken from cognitive load theory. As you process, you encode and build your long-term memory store, and that changes as you retrieve information. You encode more information. You include and incorporate new ideas and information into your long-term memory. Now that obviously is built upon constructivism, which talks about mental models or schematas that are actively built, expanded, revised. So you've got processes of adaptation, assimilation. I can't remember what the other one was, but anyhow. And they also talk about prior knowledge here. And they say that weak prior knowledge increases the likelihood of misconceptions and reduces the ability to learn more complex concepts. So some of your subjects and some of you will disagree with that. Some of our academics here will say that actually in our subject it's a different story when it comes to prior knowledge. And what knowledge are we valuing here anyhow? So what does prior knowledge mean? We're talking about exclusive knowledge sets that come from other and what have you. And actually we need to be more inclusive about the knowledge that helps and supports understanding. But anyhow, so there's some principles that are espoused by the core content framework. Let's look quickly then at teaching strategies that flow from that. It mentions very briefly explicit teaching of knowledge and skills, but it doesn't talk about what it means by that. And increasingly, we are seeing in the literature explicit teaching, certainly in generic teaching texts, begin to take what? Well, become more popular, and it has strong links to direct instruction. So teacher-led direct instruction, essentially, you can read by that. But the CCF itself doesn't say it's that. So the CCF isn't itself talking about that as an approach. Talks a lot about the scaffolding or the approaches within direct instruction that I would label as scaffolding. So you've got modeling, worked examples, the provision of actual scaffolds, questioning, etc. You've got sequencing considered at length in the core content framework. So the introduction of material in steps, supporting and building from cognitive load theory, that you can't overload all at once. You're linking to previous learning, which is bringing things in from retrieving things from the long-term memory, that you should build foundational knowledge before going on to look at more complex knowledge sets. And critical thinking requires a secure foundation of knowledge. You can't think critically, you can't evaluate, you can't assess until you've got strong knowledge foundations. Excuse me. That's controversial to some degree. And again, different subjects will have different takes on whether or not that fits with their subject. Practicing that leads from sequencing to some degree, and leads from direct instruction and explicit teaching, is also features heavily regular revisiting of content, retrieval of content, the spacing of the learning of content and the retrieval of content so that it is reinforced and becomes more embedded within long-term memory. And also what is talked about, but sorry, I've gone entirely too fast, is a little bit, it's talked a little bit about grouping, and I'm talking here about the social context of learning. It talks a little bit about, says paired and group activities can lead to success. It talks about flexible grouping approaches, so not putting pupils in set groups all the time, and that any kind of grouping situation needs careful selection and monitoring. Fine. So look, there's lots of strategies there that are supportive and helpful, give at the right time, with the right content, with the right, subject matter, with the right students, etc. The key thing is, I go back to the end of Catherine McCrory's video, is it's not just about what works, it's about what works under what conditions and to what end. It's about far more nuance than you often get given. Okay. I take it back to the EEF review of the evidence. It's about how you use your professional judgment to incorporate those into your teaching practice, but also how you remember and still prioritize the things that aren't prioritized by the core content framework. So things like the social context of learning, social and emotional aspects of learning, etc. Why engage critically? Well, essentially, I've talked about these things, but look, it has slightly political origins, the core content framework. It's an expert subject group subject to DFE terms of reference that put this together. It conveys a particular approach to teaching and learning, which aligns, in a sense, to a more knowledge-rich curriculum. at the time there was a lot of criticism of the limited and narrow range of research and evidence included to support it. So there, we know there's a lot missing in our perspective, from our perspective, and it's also not subject specific. And we really need it to be considered. And you every one of your teaching decisions is made based on what you teach and what you have to teach and the abilities of students in your classes. A lot of the research isn't. So, is ultimately the core content framework an attempt to apply just generic, a sort of whitewashed generic teaching principles to all teaching at all times? Or is it actually an honest attempt to say, look, we need to build more academic rigor and research and evidence base to our practice? Maybe it's a bit of both. It's for you to decide. In terms of how pupils learn, it's certainly, I'll just put, this is the learn that statements for how pupils learn, one of the sections, and it is very much about cognitive processes. As you can see here, it's about memory, it's about working memory, long-term memory, it's about the sequencing of knowledge acquisition, and then it's about some strategies, it's about practice, about information retrieval, spacing of that, and worked examples. So there we go. But, the problem that many people pointed out at the time, that it's entirely individual in the head phenomenon. Don't talk about the social context of learning. Doesn't really speak in great detail about groups. Mediation of learning through interaction is almost entirely absent. And therefore, that has significant consequences for pedagogy. It becomes, if you're just taking as your starting point and your end point, the core content framework, does it become something that's individualized? It's much more about memorization. It's about knowledge recall. What about thinking skills? What about other more broad social skills that surely the purpose of schooling is to foster in young people? So anyway, so there we go. And obviously, we want you, going back to my conclusions from my earlier video, let me move myself out of the way, to be able to filter whatever new approaches government takes to teaching and learning, or others take to teaching and learning, your schools, for example, your senior leadership teams. We want you to be able to unpick and interrogate them, to filter out or filter and reveal any attempts at reductionism, selectivism, absolutism, claim creep, etc. So there we go. Let me quickly pause the video and then keep going. Right, so where have we got to? Let me just move this. So let's